Okay, time for the after show as we'll talk about politics on this episode of the Improbability Engine. And I'm Will Aubrey. My buddy Joe Darnell is here with me. And Joe, we finally got to see the Republican plan for health care. And it's, I don't guess I should be surprised, but it's about what it's, and actually I'm not. It's really about what I expected that it would be. Massive tax cut for the rich, and they keep the individual mandate. They just change the name of it, and instead of paying the penalty to the government, you pay it to the insurance company.
So, yeah, nothing's changed. No, the thing that surprised me about it was, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. These are the same people who when Donald Trump was quoted as saying that, nobody knew that healthcare would be so complicated. That kind of tips his hand, and you go, yeah, you think? This is something that America struggled with for a while now. You're right. I'm not surprised, I don't guess, by the nature of it and how it's done. The biggest issue for me is that millions will be without coverage. They will not have coverage. Anybody who tells you different is selling you something. There will be millions of people who currently have coverage under the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, that will not be covered under Trump care. That's what it is. The one glaring weakness of the Affordable Care Act, and we've talked about this before off air, is that it doesn't cover enough people. It's kind of a stopgap, middle-of-the-road, mealy-mouth solution.
Well, and it's a giveaway to insurance companies.
It absolutely is. So what do Republicans do? They notice the shortcomings of the ACA, and they double down on them.
That's right.
Why not cover less people, give more money to insurance companies? Problem solved. Oh, and by the way, we can cut taxes on rich people who had to, had to pay a couple $1,000s more a year to ensure that hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, didn't die prematurely by not having access to health care.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it hasn't been passed yet. Who knows what will happen? There are actually a lot of Republicans who don't like it, who have spoken out against it.
Yeah.
They call it Obamacare Light, and that's really kind of what it is. It's Obamacare that doesn't cover as many people.
Yeah, it's the issue for me, the thing that I look at with that is there are a lot of Republicans who will come out against it publicly, but I think they're going to galvanize behind it because the mantra for the past decade has been repeal and replace. Repeal and replace, repeal and replace. They've never once given us a view of what their plan is. And in fact, up until the point they released it, they had it under lock and key and under armed guard in the Capitol. They wouldn't let Republican senators come in and look at the bill. Just think about how insane that is. You know it stinks whenever that happens. And now there's a big fight against the Congressional Budget Office that normally does grading and tells you, okay, this is what this is going to do. This is how much this is going to cost. Now they're premature. They're attacking the CBO saying, well, they're biased, they're political, they don't know.
Did you see the press secretary? And did you see that?
I did. The stacks of paper. Yeah, this is what people don't seem to understand. Anybody who's ever bought a house knows the paperwork gets thick. And there's a reason for it. And you can complain that it's a lot of legal jargon and it makes it more difficult and it should be a fairly simple task, but it's not.
Interestingly, of course, now what we were talking about was that Sean Spicer came out and he had the Obamacare legislation stacked up and then the Republican replacement stacked up, and
Republicare
was a much shorter stack. And he pointed to the Obamacare stack and he said, "That's government," and pointed to the Republican stack and said, "This isn't." Which there are all kinds of things wrong with that. But the interesting thing is, more than 10% of the pages in the Republican plan are devoted to denying Medicaid coverage to people who win the lottery.
Here's the issue I have with it. If you're looking for a visual, that's great. The problem is it's so transparent that it does not function well. Because all you'd have to do is get a list of the names of people who've signed up for the ACA and a list of people who would be eligible for Republicare.
Well, and let's make it clear why the Republican stack is smaller. It's not an entirely new plan. All it does is change a few aspects of the Obamacare plan.
It's almost the same.
So if you are taking a law and making a few changes to it, the stack of paper you need to make the changes is going to be much smaller than the stack of paper that was necessary for the original law.
Yeah, and it's my hope is that there are people who are not dumb and will notice this very glaring thing. I hope that's the case, because honestly, this is the biggest joke I've ever seen. It is a really sad, sick joke, but it's a joke that they're going to call this an improvement, because it doesn't improve anything. It just doesn't.
The other big story in politics this week, although it's starting to recede a little bit,
Russia.
Was not Russia.
Oh, God. Okay.
It was President Trump tweeting that he had just found out that President Obama had, quote, tapped his wires.
He spelled it wrong. That was what was funny.
And the interesting, and he sent 2 or 3 other tweets out claiming that Obama had him wiretapped during last year's campaign. The FBI director, James Comey, says that's not true.
Right.
And even Trump's surrogates refused to defend what he said. They all every one of them came out and said, well, we need to find out if this is true. None of them said what the president said is accurate. They just all said, well, we need to find out if it's true.
This is where absurdity meets reality.
Well, it could be grounds for impeachment. I don't think they're going to impeach him, but
not with the Republican House, anyway.
It's clearly libel if it's untrue.
Yeah.
Which makes him subject to lawsuits.
Right.
One legal scholar said that if you lie about something that would be an impeachable offense, then lying about it is an impeachable offense.
That's an interesting take, and one that I hadn't heard of. The biggest thing to remember as it comes to this, to this whole concept, is that the only people who are saying this are conspiracy theorists and the President of the United States.
Yes.
Because the National Security Advisor under the Obama administration says, no, it never happened. Now, you could say, well, what else would he say? That's fine. The current FBI director says it didn't happen. So, one of two things has happened. There was a wiretap or there wasn't. Okay, if there wasn't, then this is all a big lie. If there was, then what that points to is something far more sinister than, well, the president ordered a wiretap, because he can't do that.
Right. And
he legally can't do it.
Republican Senator Lindsey Graham made this point, and he actually physically dropped the microphone right after he made this point. He said, if a FISA court issued a warrant for a wiretap of Trump Tower, then that's only because a judge determined there was probable cause to believe that crimes had been committed.
In which case, I think there needs to be a hearing on those findings, on the findings that had a judge.
Yeah, if that turns out to be the case.
Let's call this what it is. Impeachment is not conviction.
Right.
Impeachment is indictment. It's taking it to the court of the Senate. The Senate is the jury. They're going to figure out if it's true or not. But when you talk about impeachment, that's the big thing. Is there grounds? Is there a reasonable level of conclusion that says, you know what, crimes and misdemeanors might have taken place. This needs to be taken and put to the Senate to see what they think.
Now, I did a little reading about this,
Yeah.
and apparently what Trump said was based on a story on Breitbart News, which was based on a story in, I believe the name of the publication's The Telegraph in Great Britain, but
Okay.
I could be wrong about that. The woman who wrote the story for the British publication says that the Breitbart article distorted what she said, and that
surprise me.
and that what Trump said distorted what the Breitbart article said.
Right.
So that by the time it got from what she wrote to what Breitbart wrote to what the Trump allegations were, it was like you played gossip in a fifth grade schoolroom.
And that's the point where libel can come in. Because the first level of that, the Telegraph writing an article, a researched and sourced article, which you have to believe the Telegraph. That's a pretty good news source. That unto itself is its own thing. If he just quoted it, or if he said, interesting that this happened, then the onus is not on him, it's on the Telegraph. When Breitbart took it and they changed what it said to mean something different, and then said that is grounds for libel, right? I mean, you could take them because they have taken a sourced story and have twisted it to their own ends and made it lie,
Right.
which is libel. When the president takes that and makes a direct accusation towards a person, that is the definition of libel. I mean,
And is there any doubt that it was malicious?
No, absolutely not.
Because, you have to satisfy two standards for it to
Right.
be libel. It has to be false and it has to be malicious.
I think in this instance it's both, and I think that's the thing that I think the surrogates for Trump are starting to realize that whenever he goes off on walkabout on some of this stuff, that if they jump in and really support him, that they're just as guilty. So they're trying not to commit themselves to that level as well, and that's what's really sad about it. I like to talk about Russia.
Okay.
More news is broken about ties to Russia. Jeff Sessions, of course, has recused himself. It seems that everybody had ties to Russia during the campaign for Trump for the presidency. None of that is entirely surprising. What is surprising is that the Trump administration recently named the ambassador to Russia, and it's former Utah governor and presidential candidate and ambassador to China, John Huntsman. Now, you and I have spoken about John Huntsman before. He's actually a guy that I respect quite a bit.
Indeed.
He's intelligent and articulate. He knows exactly, his politics might not equal mine, but you don't have to have that to have my respect. So whenever I heard that, it gave me two things. The first is it looked like a conciliatory tone being struck by the Trump campaign by naming him a person who's respected on both sides of the aisle, who generally he's got chops. He knows what he's doing. It's not crazy. This guy's good at what he does. But what undermines that in my own thinking is that it doesn't really matter what the ambassador to Russia says or does if there's direct contact between the Trump administration and its officials with the Russian government. You're bypassing the Department of State. So while on one hand I'm encouraged by Huntsman taking the job because he's tough, he's smart, and he will represent the United States fairly and evenly, I still have no confidence in the Trump administration. So it's a very difficult time, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Oh, I agree with everything you just said.
Well, write that down.
the latest Russian news involves a cruise missile that they're evidently deploying. The article that I read about it this morning was confusing because on one hand it said that the missile was being deployed in violation of a treaty with the United States. And then it said that the State Department had alleged that the Russians were evading the treaty, which makes me want to see exactly what the treaty says and what the Russians are doing. Because there's a difference between evading a treaty and violating a treaty.
Right. The biggest issue with cruise missiles is that cruise missiles fall into a gray area. When a lot of the treaties were being written in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the idea of a battlefield tactical nuclear weapon, be it an artillery shell or a small rocket-delivered nuclear weapon that would be small. It would not be an intercontinental ballistic missile. It would not be an intermediate range. It would not be it's a small nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon. Those have been outlawed. And the ones that still existed, or for new nuclear powers, the rules had been that command and control of existing weapons like that should never be on the battlefield. It should be separate, and it should be done from a separate command and control structure in the centralized government. And the reason why that's important is generals make tactical decisions, but that weapon is not a tactical weapon. It is bigger than that. So it needs to be, decision-making needs to be at the governmental level. So when you deploy a cruise missile from land and by land, you could run up against some of these nuclear, tactical nuclear weapon regulations that have been signed under numerous missile treaties for a long time. And I think that's why there's some ambiguity there. Because it's not necessarily nuclear, but is nuclear capable. And deploying nuclear capable weapons at the battlefield level is dangerous precedent. It is something that has been worked against for generations now. And that's just something that needs to be watched into. And it's something I'm going to look into now as well, because that's a big deal. I mean, how you go about doing that is really touchy.
There are a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about. One deals with, well, they both deal with episodes of American Masters that I saw over the last few days.
Right.
One deals with...
Now, for those who don't know, what is American Masters?
It's in its 30th or 31st season on PBS, and it profiles famous Americans who've made a significant contribution in some field.
Okay.
Now, it does not have to be in the entertainment industry.
Right, gotcha.
But the two that I'm going to cite were in the entertainment industry.
Absolutely.
One is Nat King Cole.
Fantastic singer.
Just incredible. His recording of Mona Lisa is one of my favorite songs ever. And he was just amazing. And by the way, if you ever get a chance to see the W.C. Handy story, which he stars in,
right,
you ought to watch that, because that's an amazing movie. Anyway, he, and I have to mention this, I guess, for it to make sense, just for the people who may not know who he was a black man.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, he did very well, became wealthy.
One of the most famous singers
in the world.
I mean, was mentioned there with Sinatra and with some of these others that were musical superstars of their time.
He bought a home in a rich neighborhood in L.A., and people burned crosses on his lawn, and defaced his property. That's mind-boggling to me, that even someone as famous and wealthy and talented as he wasn't good enough for them because he was black.
Yeah, and it actually echoes some of the things that I've read or heard by numerous African American scholars, and a lot of that can be boiled down to the statement of you can be rich, you can be talented, you can be famous, and you can be beloved. You're still black. And that's the devastating portion of this. I mean, I recently watched the movie 42, which it's not quite true to life, talking about Jackie Robinson, the African-American baseball player who broke the color barrier in the major leagues.
Well, and had a great number.
42.
I mean, it is the answer to everything.
Yeah, and if someone can give me the question, that would be awesome. But you know, even watching that, it just reinforces this idea that you could do anything. You could, you know, if an African-American man today discovered the cure for cancer, there would be neighborhoods that would still only see him as a black man. There'd be people who still only saw him as a black man. And I think that is the most painful and devastating thing in a critique of our society today.
I agree. The other episode that I saw was about Loretta Lynn. Loretta Lynn grew up in the mountains of eastern Kentucky.
Poor.
Yes. And she got married when she was 15.
Yeah. Not unusual for its time.
Oh, I had a great-grandmother who got married when she was 11. My grandmother got married when she was 14. They both grew up in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. All right, the movie Coal Miner's Daughter is about Loretta Lynn's life. And there's a scene in that movie, it's her wedding night, and she's 15, and she clearly doesn't know what's about to happen, and her husband forces himself on her. She tries to kick him off, and is unable to, okay? In the TV show, they're talking to Loretta, and they asked her specifically, did you know what was going to happen? And she said, no, I had no idea. My mother didn't tell me anything about any of that. If you think about it, of course it was legal then.
Right.
There were no marital rape laws then, but if you think about it, that amounted to child rape. My great-grandmother got married when she was 11. My grandmother got married when she was 14. She was pregnant 15 times. She died when she was 42. She was pregnant for half of her adult life.
Yeah.
The lives that women led then, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, I agree. And the thing to take it a step back and look at it from even a global perspective, people on the right tend to look overseas and look at the Middle East and talk derisively about, well, they marry their daughters off at 10. They marry, you know, that can't be what kind of religion is that would allow that? And the answer is we still have people from the generation in America where that was not only legal but was common. It's not.
It still happens to a certain extent here. I saw an article the other day that said that with parental consent, in many states you can get married at the age of 12.
And this is the problem that I've got with a lot of this, is that we as a country are very arrogant.
Indeed.
And in a lot of cases, we have absolutely no reason to be.
One more thing before we close here. And this could have been in the moment of what? There's a movement to elect Barack Obama president of France. They've spread posters all over Paris. Now, obviously it's not going to happen, but the leading candidate there, Marine Le Pen,
she's a far-right candidate.
Extreme far-right candidate. I saw her interviewed on 60 Minutes, and she said she's going to make it illegal to wear Muslim religious garb in public. And they ask her about, well, what about yarmulkes? You know, for Jewish people, that's going to be illegal. What I wanted them to ask is,
what about crucifix?
Well, what about nuns?
Right.
Can they still wear their habits?
Right.
France is, of course, Catholic country.
Highly Catholic, yeah. They're, I think, 85, 87% Catholic, yeah. Well, and you bring it up. Okay, so you have walked into one of the weird areas that I am actually really, really up to date on.
Okay.
French politics. Okay. So the French election system has a setup where there are numerous candidates, and they do runoff elections, eliminating lowest vote getters until you get to the final, who then becomes the president, right? You've mentioned Le Pen, who is on the far right. She's extreme right-wing Marie Le Pen. She's actually one of the representatives of France in the EU, even though she's anti-EU.
Ew.
Yeah, right. So one would think, and she's not polling very high. She's actually only in the 20s or 30s in national polls. Here's the problem. The leading center candidate, the center-right candidate, has just been embroiled in in charges that he was illegally hiring his wife and family to do jobs and paying them and then not having them do jobs.
Okay.
But he won't drop out. Despite calls from his own party for him to drop out so they could nominate somebody else, he won't drop out. They're pulling support from him as fast as they possibly can. Now, that's not frightening until you look over at Le Pen, who's still at 30% and just, licking her chops at the possibility of a weak candidate here. Well, so then you go to the left. You say, all right, well, let's look at the two leftist candidates, the socialists and the far leftists. Okay? They could not work out a deal where one of them would drop out and they would consolidate power. They're both polling at 10%. So what it's looking like is that the two left candidates will be in the first round. The tragically unable to win is the mainstream candidate, and Marie Le Pen is the only one that has a galvanized, solid background. She's going to get 32%. That's just how that's going to work. So what you have in a runoff is you have the chance for all the left candidates to go, for a weak center candidate to make it to the finals versus Le Pen, and it's anybody's election then.
Clinton versus Trump all over again.
It's one of those where you look at it and you just go, no! It's humorous, but in a tragic kind of sad way. So,
now, one good thing, in France it's a lot easier to get rid of a government you don't like than it is in the United
very
States.
true, very true. Who says the French don't know what's going on?
Are we done?
I think we're done for right now.
That brings to a close this edition of the Improbability Engine.
The world's about to be destroyed. There's no point getting all annoyed. Lie back and let the planet dissolve around. Despite those nets of tuna feet, we thought that most of you were sweet, especially tiny tots and your pregnant women. So long, so long, so long, so long, so long.